Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
On my mom's birthday, when the whole family was gathered around the dining table with plates half full and the usual background noise of overlapping conversations, my sister leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms with that smug expression she had perfected over the years, and let out a little snicker before saying, "Some of us have real jobs." The words didn't just hang in the air, they sliced through every laugh and clink of silverware, and for a second I could feel my mom's smile stiffen, though she tried to cover it with an awkward laugh. Then my dad, instead of diffusing the moment or moving on, turned his head slowly toward me with that look of half amusement, half disapproval he has carried my entire life, and asked, "Is that why she's on your payroll now?" The room went silent, not the comfortable kind of silence after a toast, but the suffocating kind where you know everyone is waiting to see how you'll react, and in that instant I realized I had two choices: either laugh it off the way I always had, pretending it didn't sting, or sit there and let the weight of their words crush me in front of everyone. I wish I could say I fired back immediately, but the truth is I froze, because this was not the first time they had taken a jab at me, it was just the most public and humiliating one. My sister has been putting me down since we were teenagers, always pointing out that her path was the responsible one, while mine was some kind of reckless gamble that made the family uncomfortable. She went into accounting straight out of college, the kind of job my dad bragged about to his golf buddies, because it sounded stable and respectable and fit into his tidy definition of success. I, on the other hand, went the independent route, freelancing at first, juggling projects, taking risks, and building something piece by piece without a safety net, which to them always looked like floundering. I remember how many times my dad would say things like, "Your sister's got her head on straight. She knows what security looks like," and then glance at me with that disappointed little sigh, as if I was some unfinished project he wished he could return. The cruel part is that my mom always tried to defend me, telling him that the world was changing and that stability didn't always come in the form of a 9 to 5, but he would brush her off with a dismissive wave, muttering about how he knew better because he had lived through harder times. That dynamic became so normal that by the time my sister insulted me at the table, I already knew she had a lifetime of reinforcement from him, and the jab about being on her payroll was just his way of signaling, in front of everyone, whose side he was really on. Sitting there that night, I felt the burn behind my eyes, not because I believed them, but because I hated that I still let it get to me. I hated that my mom's birthday, which should have been about celebrating her, had been hijacked by their constant need to position me as the weaker one, the dependent one, the one who never quite measured up. My sister knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to humiliate me in front of family friends who didn't know the whole story, who only saw the snapshot of us at that table. And my dad, well, he just couldn't resist twisting the knife, because in his mind, siding with her was safer, easier, and less complicated than admitting he might have misjudged me. I didn't respond, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew anything I said in that heated moment would either be dismissed as defensiveness or, worse, feed their narrative that I was too emotional to be taken seriously. So I bit my tongue, stared at my plate, and let the silence do the work of making me look small, while inside my head, something shifted. I realized that I had been playing this same role for years, letting them corner me into silence so they could keep their hierarchy intact, and the anger that bubbled up wasn't just about that night. It was about every single time I had been told I wasn't enough. I replayed it later in my head, lying awake that night while everyone else probably slept soundly, and I kept thinking about how predictable the whole scene had been. My sister, smug and self-satisfied, throwing her insult without fear of consequence. My dad, stepping in to underline it, cementing her point with a cruel punchline. The others at the table, shifting in their seats, pretending they didn't hear, because nobody wanted to get in the middle of family politics. It was all too familiar, and I suddenly couldn't stomach the idea of letting it continue. That night, I promised myself something. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I wasn't going to try to convince them I was worthy, or beg them to see me differently, because those days were over. Instead, I decided I would make them regret every word, every smirk, every belittling comment. I would let them trap themselves in their own arrogance, and then I would pull the rug out from under them in a way so undeniable that the room would never go silent at my expense again. The funny thing is, they had no idea what I had been working on, because I kept my cards close to my chest. For years they thought I was barely scraping by, when in reality I had been building something that was just starting to gain real traction. They thought I needed validation, when in truth I was already operating on a level they couldn't even fathom, because their world was too small, too rigid, too safe. And while they spent all that energy mocking me, I had been quietly positioning myself for a moment just like this one, a moment when their arrogance would blind them to the fact that I wasn't the weak one in the room anymore. So when I looked back at my mom's birthday, I didn't see just humiliation anymore. I saw the spark that lit the fuse. They thought they had silenced me, but really, they had just handed me the perfect stage. And if they believed I would continue to sit there and let them script my role, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Because that night, I decided the next time we sat around that table, the story wouldn't end with me in silence. It would end with them stunned, embarrassed, and for once, completely out of words. The morning after my mom's birthday, when the leftovers were still in the fridge and the fake niceness from the table had evaporated, I woke up with that heavy knot in my stomach that used to make me swallow my pride and tell myself to keep the peace. Yet this time I sat up in bed and realized I was done playing the polite daughter who absorbs the hit and smiles through it, because there comes a point where you either keep letting people define you or you decide to set the terms yourself, and I had finally reached the second option. What stung the most was not just the line about real jobs or the payroll job, it was the pattern behind it. The long record of little digs that had been filed like notes in a cabinet only I ever opened. The cabinet that held the time my dad co-signed my sister's car because she needed reliable transportation for her career, while telling me that I should learn to make do with what I have since freelancing is a choice. The time he joked in front of relatives that my home office sounded like a couch with good lighting. The time my sister rolled her eyes when I said I had a deadline and told me deadlines are for people who are employed by someone other than themselves. And the time I asked him for a small short-term loan years ago when a client paid late and he gave it with a lecture attached, then dragged that little sum around like a dog on a leash every time he needed proof that I was not as independent as I claimed to be. Those memories used to make me angry in a way that turned inward, the kind of anger that morphs into self-doubt and makes you rehearse explanations in your head for an audience that has no intention of listening. But while I made coffee and stared at my phone that morning, I realized I had an opportunity to end one of those talking points forever, so I opened my banking app, calculated more than fair interest on that old so-called favor that he loved to mention, sent a request to my bank for a cashier's check so nobody could claim it bounced, and wrote a short, surgical note that said, in plain words with no decoration, that I appreciated the help at the time, that our ledger was closed, and that any further public commentary about my finances would be treated as disrespect and result in me removing myself from the room, regardless of who is present or what we are celebrating. By noon a courier had the envelope. By late afternoon it was sitting on my dad's desk at his office where he keeps the framed pictures of achievements he respects, and while part of me expected an explosion, what I got instead was a call that started with forced humor and ended with something closer to panic disguised as fatherly concern, because he tried to tell me I didn't need to pay him back and that I was being dramatic, and I told him, calmly and without heat, that this was not about the money, but about the leash the money had given him for years, and that I was cutting it clean, and when he tried to pivot into the tired speech about responsibility, I stopped him with a sentence I had never allowed myself to say out loud. That if he brought up my finances in public again, I would stand up, hug my mother, and leave with her to finish dinner somewhere we could talk like adults without being measured on a scale he built for my sister. It is amazing how quickly a man who is used to holding the moral high ground starts reaching for new footing when the old one crumbles, because he went from teasing to confused to suddenly very quiet, and then he said he did not mean to insult me. And I told him perhaps he did not, yet the impact was the same and intentions do not erase public humiliation, and then I wished him a good day and hung up before he could drag me back into the familiar mud of circular arguments that lead nowhere but exhaustion. That should have been enough to make me feel better for the week, yet the anger had sharpened into focus, and once that happens there is no going back. Because I started looking at the last few years with fresh eyes and saw clearly all the unpaid labor I had done to keep family peace, all the times I supported my sister quietly when she was overwhelmed while she still called me unserious behind my back, all the times I brought work to her company through a friend and never asked for credit. Because I didn't want to be accused of bragging, and I realized that my silence had been the scaffolding for their version of me, which meant my silence had to go before the structure could collapse. So I took another step that felt small and large at the same time, one that would not blow up anyone's job and would not cross a line I could not defend, yet would draw a bright boundary in a way that even the most stubborn person at our table would have to acknowledge. And I did it with the same method they think only belongs to people with so-called real jobs. I documented, I itemized, I made things undeniable. I sat down and wrote a single email address to my dad and my sister, copied only my mother because she deserved to know the truth without having to piece it together through gossip, and in that email I listed, in full sentences and plain language, the times I had contributed financially or professionally to the family while being treated as a punchline, the emergencies I covered when cash was tight and nobody wanted to ask him, the projects I brought in that ended up making my sister look good at her firm, the quiet rides and favors and hours spent helping our parents navigate things that were not my responsibility, and I ended with one paragraph that stated without heat that starting now I would no longer accept public jabs about my work, that I would not be the default target at family gatherings, and that any future conversation about my worth would be redirected to evidence rather than opinions. When I hit send, my heart pounded, not because I feared their response, but because I could already sense the shift in power, the moment when you stop performing for the committee and simply resign from their jurisdiction. And the silence that followed over the next hour was the kind of silence I had needed at that birthday table. Not the silence of humiliation, but the silence that happens when people realize a door has been closed and the hinges are not rusty anymore. My sister wrote back first with a line about how I was being sensitive, which was predictable and almost generous, because it told me exactly where she intended to stand, and I responded once, briefly. That sensitivity is not the issue, and that public disrespect was, and then I did not engage again, because sometimes revenge is not the dramatic scene everyone expects, but the withdrawal of access. The refusal to continue playing the role of the family's designated chew toy, and if you do it cleanly enough it lands harder than any speech at a dinner table. And, because I am not naive and I know words alone are not enough in a family that worships proof, I set the next piece in motion quietly, the piece that would not only shut down the payroll joke forever but also expose how shallow the real job badge looks when you hold it up to actual outcomes, and while I am not ready to spell it out here yet, I will say this much. A very specific calendar invite was already sitting in a few inboxes that do not belong to my father or my sister, an invite that will reshape what they think they know about me and about the value of the work they love to mock, and when that meeting happens, I will not need to raise my voice or ask for respect, because the room itself will answer for me. When the cashier's check had landed and the email had done its quiet work and the house had settled into that strange calm that follows a boundary finally spoken out loud, I turned to the one thing that always steadied me when family noise tried to drown me out, which was the work itself, the daily rhythm of calls and proposals and follow-ups and the stubborn patience it takes to build something that most people in my family never believed could be built, and I decided that if they wanted to turn my life into a running joke about paychecks and real jobs, then I would answer in a language they actually understand, not by begging for approval or going toe-to-toe at a dinner table they control, but by showing them the one thing they cannot talk over, which is results backed by receipts and witnesses who are not related to me. That calendar invite I had mentioned in my head was not a confrontation or a trap. It was simply a standing breakfast I host once a month for a handful of clients, a couple of mentors who let me bother them with questions, and two people who have become the spine of my little team, and for the first time I added my mother and my aunt because they have always asked what I actually do with my days, and because they deserved a seat in a room where the only metric that mattered was whether people chose to work with me, not whether the job title sounded proper enough to brag about at a barbecue, and I did not add my sister or my father because the invite was not a performance or a gotcha. It was a gathering where I did not want to manage anyone's passive aggression while trying to negotiate a contract. My mom showed up with that hesitant smile she wears when she is afraid of stepping on landmines, and I told her there were none here, only people who have seen me do the thing I do and decided to keep coming back. And the relief on her face was worth more than any round of applause because it told me I had kept her too far from my world for too long, trying to protect her from the fallout of our family dynamics, when what she actually needed was to see me in my element without anyone translating me into something smaller. And as the coffee cups emptied and the easy talk of projects and timelines went around the table, I watched the way my mother listened, her head tilted in that careful way. And I saw it click for her that I was not playing at business, I was running one. There was a moment I had planned for, a short, ordinary announcement that was not ordinary for me, and when everyone settled I thanked them for trusting me and said, in the same even tone I use on client calls, that we were formalizing a role I had been hinting at for months, which was a part-time family liaison who would help us smooth communications with clients who were juggling caregiving for aging parents. Because that is a real issue that throws schedules off and raises stress for everyone. And then I said I had asked my mother to take it on because she is patient and clear and knows exactly how to advocate without making people feel bulldozed. And I told the room we would be paying her a fair monthly stipend like we pay any contractor whose work makes our work better, and I watched my mom go very still and then blink as if the floor under her had shifted. Because in that one sentence, I flipped the oldest joke in our house on its head without saying a sharp word to anyone. I did not do it to score points. Even though I am human and the symbolism tasted good for a second, I did it because it made business sense and because the dig about payroll had followed me for years like a shadow cast by a person who thought they were the sun. And this was the cleanest possible way to prove that if a payroll exists in my world, it is one I sign and take responsibility for, and that my mother's care and clarity and lived wisdom is worth more than applause on birthdays. It is worth payment and respect and a line item in a budget that I own. Word travels fast when family pride is on the line, and it travels even faster when the messenger is an aunt who has spent decades being told to sit quietly at the grown-ups table while the same two people took turns narrating our lives. So by late afternoon my sister called with that cold courtesy she uses when she wants information while pretending she does not care, and she asked how the brunch was and whether I had finally landed a predictable retainer or if I was still chasing one-off work, and I told her it went well and that I was not interested in sharing metrics with someone who had just mocked my job in front of our relatives, and she laughed that short laugh that always sounds like she is reminding me she is ahead. And then she said she heard Mom was working for me now, and that the optics were weird. And I said the optics were only weird if your worldview insists that only certain kinds of labor count, and that for the first time in a long time Mom was going to be compensated for the exact skills our family uses and ignores. And then I told her I had to jump because a client was waiting, and I hung up before she could wind herself up into one of those spirals where every sentence is a jab hidden inside advice. By evening, my father texted a single line asking if I was serious about paying my mother, which told me more about his priorities than any speech ever could. And I replied that I was very serious and that this arrangement had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the actual needs of my clients and my company. And that if he had concerns, he could share them like a professional rather than launching them across a dinner table disguised as jokes, and he did not text back, which in our house is the equivalent of a slammed door. The petty part of me wanted to savor the silence, but the disciplined part kept my eyes on the next step, because revenge that satisfies for a second but leaves you exposed is just another tantrum, while revenge that quietly rearranges the furniture so that the room simply functions differently from now on is the kind that lasts. And I had one more piece ready, one that did not violate any confidences and did not take food out of anyone's mouth, yet would make one belief impossible to hold on to. With a straight face, and that was a meeting set for the end of the week with a partner whose name my sister likes to drop because it makes her sound connected. A partner who had reached out to me through someone she does not know and who wanted to explore a project her firm had passed on as not core, and if that conversation went where I thought it might, my sister would learn a lesson my father never taught her, which is that the grown-up version of a real job is not a title, it is ownership of outcomes, and that when outcomes shift, so does the way the room treats you. I went to sleep that night without replaying the birthday scene for the first time in years, not because the hurt had vanished, but because I had finally translated the pain into steps and the steps into structure. And while I knew they would try to yank me back into the old dance the moment they felt control slipping, I also knew that the next call I took could make their favorite narrative unsellable at any table, including ours. And the only question left was whether I would walk into that meeting soft and apologetic or steady and clear, and I already knew the answer. The meeting with the partner my sister loved to name drop unfolded in a way that felt both surreal and inevitable, because as soon as we sat down and the conversation began moving past polite introductions into the heart of what they actually wanted, I realized they were not testing me or cautiously exploring whether I could keep up. They were laying out a problem they had been sitting on for months and practically handing me the pen to draw the solution, which meant the dynamic had already shifted before my sister even knew the meeting existed. And the irony was that her firm had dismissed this very opportunity as a distraction while I, the one she mocked for chasing so-called side projects, was the one positioned to take it forward. I did not rush the process, because there is power in patience and because nothing rattles people who underestimate you more than realizing you are steady where they expected you to be shaky. So I asked the right questions, clarified the messy details they had been dancing around, and then I told them exactly how my team could structure the project in phases that protected them from unnecessary risk while giving us room to deliver incremental wins. And I saw the moment in their eyes when they realized I was not a gamble. I was an investment they had been waiting to make. When the meeting ended, one of them said, "We should have come to you sooner," and I smiled politely while my mind jumped ahead to the inevitable storm that would hit once my sister heard. Because she had built so much of her superiority on the illusion that she had access to rooms I would never enter, and now here I was, not only in the room but holding the whiteboard marker. I did not brag, not to her and not to anyone else, because bragging is cheap and noise only feeds their belief that they are still the main characters, so instead I let the news travel on its own. The partner mentioned casually to someone we both knew that they were excited to move forward with me, and within 2 days my sister sent a long text that started with "funny story" and ended with a barely concealed accusation that I was stepping into places that were already spoken for. I read it twice, breathed, and then answered with one sentence that simply said, "The door was wide open. I just walked through it." She called me within minutes, furious, asking if I was trying to embarrass her, and for the first time I did not get pulled into the spin cycle of her defensiveness. I just told her the truth, that the only thing embarrassing was dismissing opportunities because they did not fit a rigid checklist, and that people who actually know how to build trust do not need to announce themselves as gatekeepers. Her silence on the other end of the line was almost as satisfying as the deal itself, because it meant she had no script ready for a version of me that refused to grovel or explain, and eventually she muttered that this was going to make family dinners awkward, to which I responded that dinners had been awkward for years. The only difference now was that the awkwardness would no longer come at my expense. She hung up without saying goodbye, which was exactly the kind of exit she used to accuse me of making when I refused to play along, and I sat there with my phone on the table realizing that something fundamental had cracked open, because for once she could not spin the story into one where I was still the punchline. But the real turning point was not even the deal itself. It was what happened afterward when my father, who had heard the news through the same family grapevine that carried everything else, called me in a tone that was not angry or dismissive but confused, almost rattled, as if he was trying to recalibrate how he saw me without admitting he had been wrong for years. He asked, cautiously, if it was true that I was leading this project, and I told him yes, it was already moving, and he said, "But why you?" in that tone that carried all the weight of his disbelief. And I answered as evenly as I could that it was me because I had earned their trust, because I had listened when others had brushed them off, and because sometimes the person you think is least serious is the one quietly preparing for the moment everyone else fails. He did not argue, which in itself was shocking, but he also did not congratulate me, which told me that his pride was wrestling with something bigger than his mouth could handle. And I let the silence stretch until he changed the subject to something mundane like the weather, because I knew that if I pressed, he would retreat into old patterns. And what I wanted was not a forced apology, but the realization that his grip on the family narrative was slipping. Meanwhile, my mother's response was the opposite, because she called me later with a voice so full of relief that it almost broke me, and she said she was proud, not because of the deal, or the money, or the optics, but because for once she had seen me stand tall without being pushed down, and she admitted that for years she had wanted to intervene, but feared it would only make the fights worse, so she had settled for quiet support. And hearing her finally speak that out loud felt like a weight sliding off both our shoulders. I knew then that the tables were turning, not in some dramatic Hollywood scene where I stood up and delivered a speech, but in the slow, undeniable shift of gravity that makes people look around and realize they are no longer standing where they thought they were. My sister had lost the exclusivity she clung to, my father had lost the certainty that he always knew best, and I had gained something they could not take back, proof that I belonged in rooms they did not control. Yet I also knew this was not the end, because pride like theirs does not fold quietly, it claws for a last hold, and I could already sense they were planning their counterattack, whether through snide comments at the next gathering or subtle undermining behind my back. And that was fine, because I had one more move they did not see coming, one that would not only seal my position, but leave them with nothing left to weaponize. The only question that kept circling in my mind was whether I should deliver it quietly, like every other step I had taken, or whether the final strike should land in the very place where this all began, at the family table, with every witness who had once sat in silence, forced to see the shift with their own eyes. And as I turned that question over, I realized the answer was already forming, because sometimes silence is power, but sometimes the most devastating revenge is the moment you choose to speak. I decided the final move would not be a fight in the hallway or a text war that dragged on for days. It would be a table, the very same setting where they had taken their little swings for years, except this time the table would be mine, the guest list would be mine, the agenda would be mine, and the story would be told without me raising my voice or asking anyone for permission, because if they wanted the room, I would give them the room, only I would change the gravity inside it so completely that the old script could not survive a single course. I called it a do-over dinner for my mother, which she deserved after the last one was hijacked by egos and one-liners, and I booked a private room where there would be no neighboring tables to turn their heads when the tension spiked. And I invited the usual family orbit along with a few people they did not recognize immediately, people who in my world are simply colleagues and partners, but in theirs would register as witnesses. And I did this not to humiliate anyone but to make sure that when the truth landed it had a place to sit. My sister arrived with that tight smile that says she already has the summary ready in her head. My father walked in with the familiar authority that he carries like a jacket he never takes off, and my mother came a bit early and sat beside me, asking in a low voice if tonight was going to be peaceful, and I told her it would not be noisy, which is not the same as peaceful, and she nodded like she understood more than I said. I started with a toast that was not a toast in the usual sense, because I did not ask anyone to raise a glass or pretend they were excited about what I was going to say. I thanked my mother for showing up through every season when it would have been easier to pretend she did not see what was happening, and I thanked the people at the far end for choosing to work with me when they had other options. And then I said as casually as I could that before dinner arrived I had 2 quick updates to make. Sure, nobody left confused about the story they were allowed to tell about me after tonight, which made my sister's fork pause midair and made my father lean back in the chair he has used like a throne since I was a kid. The first update was simple and clean and done, because I said that starting this month my company had formalized the caregiver liaison role we had piloted, and that my mother had accepted it because she is calm under pressure and impossible to manipulate, and that she would be compensated at the rate we pay any contractor whose work reduces chaos, which means this was not charity or optics, but payment for work that improved outcomes, and I let the sentence sit long enough for my father to get whatever he needed to get out of his system without making a scene, and then I added that I had also signed a small slice of equity over to her, not a gesture but a real stake, so that when the company grows, she grows, and when people talk about who I work for, they remember that the person who has my back also has a seat, which is the kind of sentence that does not require applause because the meaning does the clapping on its own. My sister tried to laugh, the way she always does when she feels the ground shifting, and she made some comment about creative titles and family payrolls, except the words died on the way out because the partner 2 seats down, the one she loves to drop into conversations like a shiny coin, cleared his throat and said in an ordinary business tone that our collaboration had moved from exploratory to active, that the scope they had parked because it was supposedly not core had found a home with me and my team, and that the first milestones were already approved, which meant that the work she had dismissed as side hustle now had formal deliverables and a budget attached. And the room made a tiny sound that only happens when people's faces try to catch up to new information. I did not gloat, because gloating is what small wins demand, and this was not small. I simply turned to my mother and told her that a portion of the revenue from that project would fund a caregiver microgrant in her name for clients who were drowning while trying to keep elders afloat, and that she would vet the applications because she knows the difference between a story that asks for help and a story that asks for attention, and my mother's hand went to her mouth the way it does when joy sneaks up on her, and she whispered that she did not know what to say, and I told her she did not need to say anything because the point of the grant was to reduce the number of nights people like her go to sleep feeling like they failed someone they love. My father asked a question meant to sound neutral about whether I had considered the optics, and I answered that I had considered the work, and that optics and work are not synonyms, and that if he wanted to talk about appearances, we could start with the appearance that his jokes were harmless when they were not, and then I reminded him that the old ledger was paid in full with interest and retired, and that any new ledger would be built on evidence and respect, and he nodded once in a way that told me he had finally grasped that the leverage he thought he had been using all these years had been repossessed without the courtesy of a notice. The second update was shorter and sharper, and it was the one I had carried like a quiet blade in my pocket, because I said that moving forward I would not sit through public jabs about what constitutes a real job, and that any version of that line aimed in my direction would end the evening for me immediately, and that this was not a threat or a performance, but a boundary that would be enforced without ceremony. And then I turned to my sister and told her I had no interest in competing with her, that she can keep whatever scoreboard she needs to feel safe, but that she would not be allowed to use me as the punchline that props it up, and if she slipped out of habit, the consequence would not be an argument in the driveway, it would be my absence. And I would not ask anyone to follow me out. For a long moment nobody spoke, and then the partner, who is not family and therefore owes nobody a script, thanked me for the clarity in that practical voice clients use when they want to stay on schedule. And the spell broke not with applause, but with the subtle recalibration that happens when the center of a room relocates and everyone has to face a new direction. We ate, and people talked, and my mother's cheeks stayed flushed in a way that said she was both proud and a little stunned, and my father was strangely quiet in a way that read less like sulking and more like recalculating, and my sister kept glancing at the partner as if hoping for a line she could use later, only there was nothing for her to borrow because the story now had too many witnesses. When dessert came, I stood once more, not to twist the knife, but to make the point unmistakable, and I said that I was grateful for the years when nobody believed I could carry anything heavy because they taught me to carry it alone, and that I was not mad anymore because anger is a form of attention and I had better places to put mine, and then I raised my glass to my mother, whose name will now live on the paperwork and the checks and the little notes that go with the microgrants we send. And I thanked everyone for coming, and I sat down with the kind of calm you cannot fake. The silence that followed was the same silence I heard on my mother's birthday, only this one did not make me small. This one stretched like a clean field that finally belongs to the person who has done the work, and in that space my father did not dare reach for a joke. And my sister did not have a line ready, and my mother leaned in close and whispered that she felt seen, which was the only verdict I needed. I did not win by humiliating anyone. I won by changing the architecture of the room they thought they owned, and by the time the plates were cleared the story they had used for years could not stand up anymore, which meant I did not have to stand up to it either. I just had to let it fall.